Jerika was on the other side of the world, deep in the rural Balkans for her doctoral field studies. It was hard work interviewing strangers in another country. And it could be dangerous, too. Walking those long, isolated roads by herself, it left her vulnerable to harassment. But she was staying in the house of her mentor, a well-respected older professor she'd been working with for the past couple of years, and she thought she'd be safe there. He promised her she would have the place to herself, and she had every reason to trust him. He'd already helped her so much, and she knew he'd helped a lot of other students like her. She also knew he was widely loved, both locally and in academic circles. She even babysat his grandkids a few times. All the signs pointed to this being a man she could rely on, not just for advancing her studies, but for helping her feel safe so far from home. Academia is already hard enough. It's a high-pressure environment with little room for error, especially for students without educational or financial privilege in their families. Jerika was grateful to have someone like her mentor looking out for her. But then he said he needed to stay at the house for a few days while he was in town for a conference. The house he'd assured her that she'd be alone in. Those few days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. And for the first time since she started with this man, Jerika was forced to wonder, is something not right here? I'm Leah Denton, and this is Psychotherapy, a show dedicated to providing survivors of therapy harm a platform to share their stories, and to offer language for those of us trying to make sense of our own experiences with the psycho in the therapist chair. This week's guest is Jerika Heinze, a trauma specialist who's completing her doctoral studies in cultural anthropology. Jerika is also a leading expert in the nature of adult grooming and is the founder of the Fieldwork Initiative, an organization that addresses sexual harassment in fieldwork worldwide. And that's part of why I wanted to talk with her. While her story isn't one of therapy harm, her insights are invaluable for learning about the process of adult grooming, which we see all the time in therapeutic abuse. And studying the complex dynamics of grooming isn't just an intellectual exercise for Jerika. It's very much part of her own story. That mentor she lived with in the Balkans, it's only in retrospect that she was able to see how he had spent 2 years grooming her for sexual abuse. The harm he caused her wasn't an abrupt, unexpected impulse or a moment of weakness, or whatever language people use to try to minimize abuse and pardon abusers. It was the culmination of a methodical process of grooming. He had worked very carefully to establish a sense of dependence, a sense that Jerika would never succeed in school or get her career off the ground without his help. And then, another key component of grooming, he worked to isolate her and make it harder and harder for her to turn to anyone else.
It played out, like I said, slow burn. It's almost like when you're watching a movie, a horror movie, this early part is usually about that happy family or just in general positive. And then that slow kind of single buzz music that starts to get your nerves unnerving starts to play very subtly. And you think, is something kind of happening here? That's very much how it happened with me. The idea that this person would perpetrate any kind of romantic or any kind of sexual advance towards me was unthinkable in my mind. I did never have a teacher or somebody in that capacity sort of perpetrate any kind of boundary breaching. So for me, that was sort of a foreign idea, and it was naive, I'd say. I'd heard about it. I knew it happened. I just didn't know it was happening to me. And so essentially it was a lot of help. This person was like, you are such a brilliant scholar. I'm not going to let you not succeed. So it's almost like people say love bombing, but it was almost like support bombing for my career and my academics.
Once he'd carefully cultivated that sense of dependence and isolation, he was ready to step things up. But again, it didn't happen all at once. Nothing drastic that might set off too many red flags.
Shortly after I arrived there at the house, he said, "Oh, guess what? I'm going to be in the area. I'm going to fly. I have a conference I want to participate in, and maybe I'll stop in and visit you." Once he was there, that very first night, I don't know how much detail you want, but that very first night, there was a dinner at the house. And that's the very first sense that this is a little odd. And it just grew and grew. And he didn't leave the house after that. He decided actually he thinks he'll stay here.
Once they were alone together in that rural house, Jerika's mentor started making sexual advances, and she assured him many times that she wasn't interested in anything romantic or physical. And each time he apologized and said, of course, they could just be friends and colleagues. But when she'd try hunkering down and focusing on her work, he would insist they do something more leisurely, maybe drink some wine or take a long walk together. And when she started taking initiative with her work, like arranging interviews on her own, he'd get offended. He needed to be in control.
He really started to take control over what I was doing. And then it just sort of grew and grew and grew. It grew until the sentiment was so palpable with me, trying to touch, rubbing up against me, walking in while I was in the shower and saying it was an accident, things like that. And it became so palpable that I just sort of had to say, "Hey, look, I'm not interested in anything like that." But every time that happened, it was an immediate, no, I'm so sorry. And then, can I have a hug to show we're still friends? But as soon as that happened, it was almost like it went right back into it.
Jerika felt stuck. She wasn't comfortable being in that house with him. But in the rural area surrounding them, she didn't feel safe on her own either. Part of her still felt like she needed his protection. And again, this was very much by design. It's how grooming works.
It felt like a trap. It's almost like every moment, that constant worrying, is today going to be the day that something happens? And that ultimately did happen. He sort of lured me back to the house after I said I didn't want to go, saying he had news about a grant that was secured for the research. And once I was there, it culminated into a sexual assault. After it happened, he sort of pushed me against the wall where I couldn't move my head back. He just lunged at me to have a makeout session that he was hoping for. He had been drinking. I could feel that. And as soon as I stepped into the foyer of the house, he closed the door behind me and just sort of lunged at me. Once I fought back viciously, that I did. I kicked him, I pushed him, but I was up against the wall where I couldn't move my head back. So if you can imagine someone's trying to come into your personal space of your face, I didn't have anywhere to go. It was probably about 5 seconds, but it was such a jarring, sort of shocking moment that I didn't expect, because he turned to close the door and then it happened. And then I went to leave and he stood in front of the door and said he is not letting me leave unless I shake his hand and tell him that I forgive him, that this was a momentary lapse of judgment, that one momentary lapse of judgment does not undo an entire career of him helping students and helping people. And I am to sit down on the couch and have a conversation with him like an adult, and I'm not to run away like a child. And I'm going to sit down on the couch and talk to him until we shake hands and agree that this is okay and we're going to move forward, just like we're going to be fine together. I think that was the first moment I thought he could kill me. Whenever I would go for the door, he would go and try to block it. I had absolutely no idea what could happen because the cat was out of the bag now. He couldn't deny that he wasn't grooming me, that this wasn't all a trap. It had happened. And my brain was just like a scanner running code, what to do in this moment. I was sitting there completely in a state of, I don't even know the word, while he's ranting about all the things he's done. He's marched with women in Washington. He cares about women's rights, and this is ridiculous. And he's just talking about all his accomplishments while I'm sitting there. And even in short moments where I would shift in my chair, he would jump up because he thought I might be going for the door. That was very scary to be held. Ultimately, I was sort of forced to shake his hand, and I did. I shook his hand and said, "This is fine. I'm tired. I just want to go to sleep now." And as soon as I shook his hand and went out the front door, I immediately ran to where I had my things. There was another access to the house. I took my phone, my charger, my laptop, some clothes, and I left in the middle of the night.
The next day, once he realized she was gone, he started calling her again and again. Meanwhile, she'd also been getting emails from her university asking for progress reports. Academia is already stressful enough, and now she knew she could no longer trust the man who had been her mentor and primary support. The man who'd spent 2 years helping her and building trust, whose intentions turned out to be far more sinister. The man who kept calling her, even as she was trying to escape him.
It ultimately culminated into me answering the call and recording it and confronting him about this. And I have that phone recording. Nobody can ever say that didn't happen to me. I needed that because he has so much power and he's got a track record and he's very charismatic. Everyone loves him. He's got many allies. After this happened and I recorded the call, I didn't know what to do. I thought he might come after me. I know the secret about this. I know too much now. And so I felt that sense of who knows what's possible. The whole floor dropped from under me. So I took that recording to local police, which is what I was advised to do by almost everyone in the Western academic world who I got for help. They said, well, I don't know, if a crime happened and you're on the other side of the world, go to police. And when I did go to police and gave the recording, I was told that I was under arrest, that I had just admitted to committing a crime because it's actually illegal to record someone without them knowing in that country. And they said it did not matter what was on the tape. Basically, well, you just walked in here and admitted to a crime. What are we supposed to do now? And so even then, I felt like I was in big trouble. I'm in trouble, right? So the idea that I was being groomed was completely the last thing in my mind because groomers take the body on of a caring person. And as it was happening, I remember thinking, even after it happened, I remember thinking maybe this is an elderly, because he was in his 70s or 80s, early 80s. I thought maybe this is some sort of an episode he's having, thinking of any possible thing other than what it was. Not only because it would be so painful and heartbreaking, but because I just couldn't accept that all of that relationship I had forged with someone who I truly felt was my mentor and the only person who helped me truly and I felt cared was in fact turning the hand of this massive form of abuse against me. And mourning them. I mean, there were so many times that even now I wish that pre-relationship existed still. There were times even when I was doing the work, I thought, geez, I wish I could just call them and ask what's a good, because they were wonderful. I wouldn't go that deep in trust with somebody that wasn't, right? So yeah, there was so much at stake with just seeing it for what it is. And that's why it's very hard for folks who endure it.
After realizing the local authorities would be no help, Jerika got back to work. She tried to keep her head down and not make any waves. But without her mentor's quote-unquote protection, she was vulnerable to sexual harassment and a number of terrifying encounters with local men. And she knew she wasn't alone. She'd heard other stories about the dangers of fieldwork and abuses of power in academia. Those stories, often told in hushed tones or in bathroom conversations at conferences, boiled to the surface when a scientist, Dr. Suzanne Eaton, was raped and murdered near where Jerika was working. Dr. Eaton was walking one of those long rural roads that Jerika and other researchers had to walk all of the time. Her tragic death made all of those other scattered stories very real and very close to home. Jerika channeled her rage and pain from Dr. Eaton's death and from everything she'd endured herself and created the Fieldwork Initiative, a collective of students and researchers working to build a support network for victims and to proactively address the ways in which their institutions leave them vulnerable to harm.
It's a culture where we're reared to accept hierarchy, accept authority, assume that authority is by nature the most rightful. This process for me has come with immense disenchantment. I used to think that people who got Nobel Prizes must be really amazing people who are wonderful and know a lot about the world. And now I realize that's not always the case. Therapists, you assume that, they must really get in that job because they want to help people and they must know so much and do so much. And then that's not always the case. So I think there is a inflated notion about who harm and good doers are within a culture. I think there is a culture where we just are taught not to challenge, or you look a bit crazy if you do challenge. I mean, there's so many things within it, a rape culture, a culture of patriarchy. I mean, all of the whole nine yards, but it's really one in which if you don't just go along with it, you suddenly become persona non grata.
Jerika says part of what makes grooming so insidious is that it maintains the illusion of choice and agency. The groomer works to systematically fence in the victim, often in ways the victim doesn't even realize in the moment. All along, they preserve the fantasy that you're choosing to have them in your life, that you can leave at any time. This is part of why it's so hard for survivors of grooming to find people who understand what they've been through. When they can't see the invisible web and all the groundwork that paved the way for abuse, too often people's first thought is, well, why didn't you just leave? That invisible web can be hard even for survivors to recognize in their own story. We've talked about this before, how often we continue to blame ourselves for not getting out sooner, not recognizing what was going on. No, I couldn't have been groomed, we might think. That only happens to children.
People are they need answers. They can't make sense of it. It's very confusing. It's really hard to believe even when the facts are laid out in front of us because it's also hurtful. This is not somebody who you just walked up to you and stole $100 out of your purse. This is someone who genuinely cultivated a relationship with the person. And there has to be a momentary divorce of loyalty that is hard for people and painful. Your logical brain knows 1 + 1 is 2, but when you're sitting there in the aftermath of a very confusing, without any answers to something that has just done a lot of harm, every cell in your body is screaming this confusing message that 1 + 1 = 7. And you don't know why, but you just know it is. It's very hard to explain. Words really haven't been invented to talk about these complex feelings after trauma and why it's so difficult for folks. Very scary also because the survivor feels like, oh my gosh, am I going crazy? I don't understand why I'm thinking this or why I'm having these thoughts. After we go through something traumatic, our brain is lit up like the 4th of July. Confusion is a natural response to trauma. And not only that, but hypervigilance. Victims often are afraid to make a next step, reporting. Anything that is definite is very scary because that person's brain, once we go through a trauma, it's a wound has been inflicted, and now we have to put our armor on. Not only are we carrying a heavy armor, but now we have to be hypervigilantly scanning the horizon and make sure nothing else sneaks up on us because that was very scary when it happened the first time. We didn't expect it.
This confusion that Jerika is referring to can be described as a form of betrayal trauma. You'll usually hear that phrase in relation to marital infidelity, but it can also apply to any betrayal in which a seemingly trustworthy and reliable person, like a therapist, or in Jerika's case, a mentor, turns out to be someone entirely different. Therapist Kim Gould, a betrayal trauma specialist at the Center for Relational Healing in Los Angeles, says betrayal trauma is commonly referred to as a shattered worldview. It takes away everything you thought you knew to be true or safe or just in the world. You're turned into an infant trying to learn to walk or talk and make sense of things in a nonsensical world. Betrayal trauma is physiological, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual. Betrayal trauma hijacks the person going through it. Physiologically, a large part of that is because your nervous system has been shocked, because there's no place to find safety, and your nervous system will send you into a hypervigilant state of fight, flight, or freeze. So many of the behaviors come from seeking safety, being a detective for hours and hours, not being able to sleep. So it looks like the person betrayed is going crazy. And there have been times that women have been misdiagnosed and labeled as having a personality disorder, when really they are just trying to adapt to this earth-shattering trauma and did not have these symptoms before the event. We become consumed with trying to understand the true nature of that person we trusted. Grooming can happen anywhere, but it often thrives in settings where there is already a lopsided power dynamic at play. A professor, a boss, a pastoral figure, and yes, a therapist. Before a relationship even begins, there's already a sense that you should defer to that person, a sense that you owe them something. And skilled groomers are very adept at leveraging that power dynamic to their purposes. At the risk of stating the obvious, this is anything but an isolated story. As long as humans have existed, there have been people in power who will look to the vulnerabilities in others that they can twist to their own advantage.
Power dynamics are a pre-programmed hierarchy that when we walk into a room, they already exist. They're not always earned. They're not consented upon always, but they are a social contract that we've all been consuming since we were born. Those power dynamics are very much at the forefront of disarming people, making them feel it's okay to be somewhere safe, who they can trust. I wouldn't just disrobe in anywhere, but when the doctor pulls the thing and says, go ahead and put this gown on, then we say, sure. It's all of that at play that in any other situation would make us challenge something. But because of that dynamic, we are already scripted that we go along with it. And so I think that's the difference. And it's obviously much more complex, but the real deep webbing, the deep embeddedment is so much at the core of grooming rather than just, being taken advantage of, right? It's really in the nucleus of the underlying grammar of situations that is so hard for people to sort of see.
In addition to this, grooming isn't always about sexual abuse either. Sometimes it can be about taking advantage of someone financially, or just the rush of having another person entirely under your control. There can be any number of end goals, but the key is that there is always an end goal.
Groomers have a need they want met, right? They want you to meet it. And the project of creating it is satisfying. That's why it's sometimes years that people create a grooming, a lot of investment. How many times have we seen that image of a very elegant, elite therapist in that amazing office, and they're sitting there with all the answers, and the person with trouble comes to them and they lay down on their couch, and the therapist is this wise figure of highly revered class, highly revered intellect, highly revered culturally. People want that. They want to be on the other end of that sort of image. And if they have people they can put in the role of making it happen, a cast almost for them, then there's so much to gain there for their ego, for their sense of importance in the world, for their need to control someone else's life and get them to believe what they tell them. So much is gained non-sexually from massaging the fact that they are this role, they're doing it, and they've always wanted it, that they're really embodying something that satisfies an idea of who they are. But by nature of it being a casting and sort of plotted out, it's not an organic truth, right? They're not really helping. They're trying to get that person as a pawn to this larger game of which they're none the wiser about. So it's immense manipulation, but what is gotten out of it is great senses of satisfaction that give people meaning or even importance in their life, fulfill fantasies even that they've had about importance, and being a person that they imagine is their happiest or best self, even though it's not who they really are at times we see.
Because the end goals of grooming can vary so much, that means there really is no one type of victim. It's a very common misconception that only children can be groomed, or only people who are financially desperate, or people who are already broken and don't have a strong sense of self. That's another reason it can be hard to talk about. We don't want people to think of us as weak or ignorant. Jerika says we need to start talking about this in a much broader sense.
I would say really it's very plural because the person who also grooms is plural, right? They want different things. They're out to get different things. So the victims and survivors are as well. We have an idea about what a victim looks like because of that same process I mentioned earlier, where we just see depictions, right? When I say sexual harassment, right away we imagine maybe a secretary, very meek and feminine, being harassed by a sort of domineering masculine figure. And that's just not always the case. Anybody can be a groomer, anyone can be a victim of grooming. I think that's really something that we want to highlight because it does such a disservice when folks who don't match that image come forward and people just think, oh, well, that's not what the script told me it looks like, so I have a hard time believing it happened, right? But I'd say the only sort of underlying characteristic is a vulnerability, a need, a willingness. When they sense that willingness, that is the gas pedal for a lot of grooming. So I think it's just something that happens within that relationship that makes the groomer feel like this is a perfect victim for me.
And just like there's no one-size-fits-all portrait of victims, groomers come in many different forms. There might be certain red flags to look for the more we educate ourselves and the more openly we talk about these dynamics. But there's no way to definitively say this is what a groomer looks like and how a groomer operates.
That's the million-dollar question. Sociopaths are real. They're living among us. And how do we know? It's very difficult. That feeling like we have to know is what fuels self-blame. That feeling like we should have seen the writing on the wall. But the reality is that we don't know something until we know it. That's really what's the hard fact about it. I think that for me, if I look back on what happened to me, I wish that I would have felt more empowered. Just that beginning feeling where I don't want to stay here if he's walking in on me accidentally in the shower. I noticed that the doors don't lock. I don't really want to stay here. If I would have felt like that is enough for me to feel like I can step away, I think that is the most important thing we can do to sort of wonder what we can do next. Just feel empowered to say, oh, I don't like this. I don't want to do it. Because that's how you're sandwiched in. That's that perfect scenario for the groomer.
Unless we somehow fully cut ourselves off from all human connection, we will always be vulnerable to meeting people who want to take advantage of us in some way. But Jerika says we can grow in our ability to listen to our own intuition, to empower that often quiet part of ourselves that says, wait, something's not quite right here.
This is something that is a process that humans have. I use the word from the Dutch language, it's grok, G-R-O-K. This is a word we teach in my training when we talk about fieldwork harassment. This is that innate sense as human beings that we all have because we are social animals. We've lived as social beings since our inception on the planet. So our evolution involves us being able to perceive deep cues about each other. If I were to write an email and say, hi, how are you doing today? It would be completely appropriate. But if I was standing in front of you with no one around and I said, hey, how are you doing today? There's something else perceived there, that extra thing, everything, the intonation of my voice, the look in my eye, there's so much there. We can walk into a room and know that people have been talking about us, even if we have zero evidence. You hug someone, you can feel they're not comfortable being hugged. These are the things that we have as humans. It's an amazing ability. Since we're evidence-based science sort of modern world, we're taught to just, oh, well, nothing's happened yet, or that's probably just being hypervigilant and such. When in fact, we really do want to start to honor those feelings, honor that feeling if you don't want to do something that you don't feel that you have to continue and be pushed into it. So honoring that growth is a really important aspect. When you were a child and you had a substitute in class one day, it took only, I'd say, 10 seconds for every single student to know if this was a substitute you could mess with or not, right? We all sense it from things, from body language. And that is so much at play in harassment or grooming or things like that. But we don't have words for it. We've not been given, we've not really explored this under a microscope to make sense of neurological processes, things like that, that groomers exploit and such. Even just words to put up boundaries and says, oh, what's your goal in asking me that? Or what's your goal in telling me that? When we're uncomfortable, we need to start having conversations. Without knowledge, people sort of are left to their own devices to try to make sense of it. And it's already very, very confusing with an extra layer of pain and harm.
And just like we as individuals can work to grow our intuition and sense of empowerment, we as a society have a whole lot of room to grow in how we treat survivors of harm. Too often in the wake of therapy abuse, and really abuse of any kind, there's a sort of secondary trauma that comes when survivors aren't treated with the dignity and care they deserve. When their stories aren't believed, or their own culpability is implied, or their abuser is just able to ride off into the sunset without consequences. As Dr. Judith Herman writes, observers who have never experienced prolonged terror and who have no understanding of coercive methods of control presume that they would have shown greater courage and resistance than the victim if they had been in those circumstances. Hence, the common tendency to account for the victim's behavior is to seek flaws in her personality and moral character.
The second level of harm that is often more public is often another layer of betrayal. We are very much, in a sense, probably neurologically lazy in wanting to re-landscape how we've created our reality, right? The idea that babysitters can sexually abuse children, oh my gosh, if that's true, then what do we do now, right? And it creates such a panic and an undermining of a reality we've created about who we can trust that people sort of are resistant to doing that and accepting it. Also, there's an immense amount of even logical fallacies at play. Just because of the processes of how our brain work, when somebody tells us about their experience, we automatically sort of loop it through how we've lived things. If we've not lived the same experience, we think, that's weird. I didn't experience any racism, right? And so when somebody tells us something that we haven't lived ourselves, people are much less likely to think, oh, are you sure it wasn't just a one-off? Or, well, gee, he has 50 other students or 50 other patients that he's seen and not one is reported. So if we use that same logic and you lived in a house for 50 years and you'd been robbed and the police came and said, well, this really doesn't make sense. You lived here 50 years and this is the first time you've been robbed. That logic would be silly to us. That just makes no sense. But yet that's the very same logic that's brought against victims of grooming or of assault. People are resistant to really knowing trauma in an intimate way. They want to view it as an entertainment, watch true crime. But when somebody comes forward and says, I need help, people are so resistant to get involved because they're deeply uncomfortable with certain realities. Knowing stuff sometimes feels like a liability to people. Reporting can be wonderful if that's somebody wants, but people often want different things in order to heal from this. Some people genuinely just want to sit down with the person and ask some questions or have a conversation. Some people want just immense support and some therapy, or there's many different things people want or might need, and they need to be in the driver's seat. And so since they haven't, and the only avenue of counterpunch against this collective harm against people and abuses of power is to sort of air it all out, and that really opens them up to so much more harm. And it's not by incident. So I think preparing people is more so letting them know that there are multiple avenues in which we can create even post-traumatic growth for them, and also preparing them about the realities, not just putting the pressure on people that they have to be the one to take this down.
That's part of what Jerika hopes to accomplish through the Fieldwork initiative and through her work as a trauma specialist. She wants to broaden conversations about grooming and trauma so that we can begin to think about it in more thoughtful and holistic ways. She wants to build more structures of community and care for survivors. And maybe more than anything, she wants them to know that they are not alone.
Behavior that we've been told and scripted about what things look like is so far from the reality. I want to ask anybody who has gone through hell to then be asked about what time was it exactly 2 years ago when you went to lunch, and the element of psychological torment as well. All of it. I think the best thing we can do is tell survivors, you are absolutely not crazy. Nothing is wrong with you. What was wrong was what happened to you. You went through something completely crazy, abnormal, life-threatening, who knows what it could be, something that genuinely terrified you. And your responses, even though they're confusing, something you've never felt before, all kinds of things, are completely natural reactions of a brain under a state of trauma. Nothing is wrong with you. So it's, I think, really an important takeaway, because you don't feel totally crazy when you're living it. And when people affirm that, yeah, you look crazy, or that's not the perfect way to react, then it's just, okay, so I for sure am.
I want to thank my guest today, Jerika Heinze, for sharing both her personal story and her valuable insights. If you'd like to connect with her or learn more about her work, you can do so at thefieldworkinitiative.org. You can also donate to the important work being done there through PayPal at fieldworkinitiative@gmail.com. If you'd like to share your story or support someone else in sharing theirs, you can reach out to me at podcast.psychotherapy@gmail.com or connect with me on Instagram at podcast.psychotherapy. And as always, thank you to the writer of this show, Bo Denton, for your skill and insight. And finally, thank you to our audience. I hope you'll join us again next time.